listening to the Mark Bradford Alchemy for Life podcast.
It's all your fault. Hey there. It's all your fault. Yep. It's all your fault. It's on your shoulders, really. I mean, the fault may be of someone else to a small degree, but really the vast majority of the fault is yours. It's you. How does that make you feel? It makes you feel oddly good, doesn't it? Because now you can fix it. Right? See, one of the biggest lessons I had to learn in going through some pretty rough times was that not everything's my fault. Now, I know what you're saying, that, with a lot of people, you would think the reverse would be the lesson, that they'd say, well, you need to take more responsibility. You need to work through this and realize that this is your doing. Well, I had the opposite lesson to learn, which is that not everything was my fault. Especially some pretty big things that were happening were not my fault. And the lesson isn't just to say, well, okay, it's not your fault. Great. Have a nice day. You're a much better person than you thought. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the lesson is it's not your fault. And the reason you think it's your fault, subconsciously or consciously, is because that's a really, really great way to exercise control. Now, you see what I'm doing here? I'm actually saying your ability to assume responsibility for something is actually detrimental. So rather than patting yourself on the back and saying, well, hey, I'll just take responsibility for that, it's on my shoulders, you're doing that to exercise and exert control over something. And it's something your brain learns to do, especially when you do have a lot of responsibility in your life. It's a knee-jerk reaction that we do sometimes, is to take this responsibility. So what do I mean exactly? What I mean exactly is that if you're going through something, whether it's something that's happening in a relationship or in your world or in your work or with your employees or what have you, you may immediately overlay, well, that's me, so that you think, well, if it's me, I have control over me, so I have control over that. Isn't that an odd thing? It's an odd thing to think that we would actually assume responsibility for something that's not our fault simply so that we can control it. Because a lack of control is kind of scary. And it can be very scary for many people. It's scary for everyone. And you hear this time and time again about people who are zen about a lot of things, that they say, there's a lot less in the universe that you can control. And it's true. There's a lot less out there that we have control over than we think. We have very little control over most things in life, and we try to exert this responsibility and therefore vicariously exerting this control over things. So do an experiment with me. Let's do that thing where you pause it. We think about something and pause it, because I could just sort of breathe, but let's do that. So think back at a time when you went through something and you struggled a lot and it was just driving you nuts. I'll bet you at least one of those times it was because you thought you had control over it and took responsibility for it. This happens all the time in relationships, and it also happens all the time with kids, where parents will say, well, it's my parenting, I could have done this way, this that way, without really giving credit to the kids. Credit may be an odd word in this situation, but giving credit to the kids to say, hey, they have their own personalities. They're like an entire human being unto themselves. Because if we say, well, it's my parenting, it's this in the relationship. So think about a time in which that happened to you. Think about it, at least think about emotionally in your emotional memory. When did something happen that just made you tear your hair out? And you're like, oh my God, I can't figure this out. This is driving me nuts. And the odds are that time was a time in which you were assuming responsibility for something that you shouldn't have. And once you finally figured out what the problem was, you stopped repeating that pattern. So go ahead and pause it if you want to think about it. or listen to the rest and then think about it, and I'll move on to something else. Okay, if you pause it, great. Then you have that memory in your brain right now. If you didn't pause it, well, I hope you do. I hope after the podcast is over, you think throughout the day, were any of the times that I had those problems because I was taking responsibility? Having said that, let me flip this over. Obviously, there is a prevalent problem out there of people who don't take responsibility for their own actions. Many times people say, it'd be a much better world if people took responsibility. And you know that when you're in a room full of people who take responsibility, or you're sitting at a table of people like that, or you have a good friend or a number of people that you have, or you're on a team, or your family, and they're all clearly people who take their own responsibility, it's a nice environment. You know, it's a very nice environment to be around people like that, because you know stuff is going to get done. You know, no one's making excuses and no one had a bad day and this and that. They're all probably movers and shakers in some ways too. But leaving the type A stressful personalities aside, I do think that when you are around people who take responsibility, you tend to do that yourself. And that leads to the problem of overtaking the responsibility I talked about. But back to the thing I just introduced, the reverse. I don't want to take anything away from people that have an issue with not taking responsibility. And in fact, if there are people that typically don't take responsibility for stuff that really is their stuff, and they hear this podcast, they'll be like, wow, I need to take even less responsibility. All right, I'm going to take a nap now. Meanwhile, something's on fire. So I don't want to send that message to those people, but not to use the those people term, but I would typically think those people might not really be listening to me right now. People who tend to take way too little responsibility tend not to listen to or read books on self-help and self-improvement. It's kind of funny, you know, it's kind of the people that are doing really well are the people always striving to do better, and the people that just kind of gave up continue to give up. So I'm talking to the people who tend to stress themselves out by taking too much responsibility. Please don't. Take a step back. Minimize your circle of influence to where it matches reality. Sometimes you have to test the waters, and like I mentioned before, parents tend to have to test the waters. When their kids get to be tweens or teens, that's when things get really difficult, because these pseudo semi-adults are doing a lot of stuff, and the parents are so used to for the last 10, 11, 13, 15 years that really they were the bottom line, that they have to start relaxing on being the bottom line. And I'm not talking about abandoning their children. I'm talking about just saying, okay, well, I guess he has to fail. I don't have the ability to control that. I can't be right behind him when he's 33, you know? So that's a lesson learned for parents who have teenagers or had teenagers. They've all had to learn that, hopefully, because if not, then they're creating these wonderful codependent units. Same thing goes for relationships. When you're in a relationship, you have to realize that you get to do a certain amount, they get to do a certain amount. I'm not saying you don't go above and beyond. I'm not saying you go right up to the 50-50 line and say, oh, I'm done. I ain't doing 51. No, of course not. That's what makes most romantic movies really fun. That's what makes relationships special, is when you go above and beyond sometimes. I'm just saying you have to be aware of that too. And finally, the same goes for the work environment. There's a lot more to responsibility than job descriptions. And you know that. You know that you can have two people with the same job description, the same position, and one person's doing a lot more and one person isn't. And we tend to leave that other person alone because it's kind of volatile. And sometimes the volatility is maintained by the manager that keeps taking responsibility, and rather than allowing that person to kind of stand on their own. So for your sanity as a parent, as someone in a relationship, as somebody on a team, just try to be mindful of this limit to your responsibility and to your control. And as always, thanks for listening. Hey there, thanks for listening. You know I always appreciate your feedback, right? Well, here's your chance. You can connect with me on Instagram, via the Alchemy for Life site, or most other social media. If you like this podcast, you may love my new book, Alchemy for Life: Formulas for Success. The 239-page paperback is available on Amazon and everywhere else you get your books. All this info is available at Alchemy for Life. Thank you. See you next week.